Simply economics, big ideas made small. Everyday money talk for any mind at all. Simply economics, learn fast, feel smart. One quick listen and you're ready to start.
Imagine a weapon that drops no bombs and fires no bullets, yet it can completely wipe out a nation's wealth overnight.
Yeah, literally leaving its citizens rationing bread. It's wild.
It really is. Today, we are looking at this silent, kind of invisible theater of war, which is economic sanctions. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. We've got a really fascinating set of notes today on economics and global politics.
We do. And our mission today is to answer a massive question based on those sources. Like, should economic sanctions actually be used as a foreign policy tool? Because, you constantly hear about countries being cut off from the global economy.
Right, it's on the news all the time.
Exactly. But we rarely stop to think about the massive invisible levers being pulled behind the scenes to make that happen.
It's basically the ultimate collision of macroeconomics and geopolitics. And what the source material lays out so clearly is that, well, these invisible levers can dismantle a nation's infrastructure just as thoroughly as a physical invasion.
Yeah.
But they do it by fundamentally rewriting the rules of survival for the targeted country.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we want to understand the reality where economic costs are weaponized to achieve these geopolitical goals, we kind of have to start with the mechanics.
Right, the how of it all.
Yeah, let's look at the machinery itself. The primary lever here is trade restrictions. But we aren't just talking about like a tariff on imported steel or something.
No, definitely not.
We are talking about severing a country's arteries to the global marketplace.
Exactly. When a sanction is imposed, you're effectively building a legal and financial wall around an entire economy. Because in a globalized world, no nation produces everything it needs, right?
Sure, everyone imports something.
Exactly. They rely on selling their primary exports, whether that's, oil, technology, or agriculture, just to generate foreign currency. And they use that foreign currency to buy what they lack.
So when you legally block their access to international markets, you aren't just stopping goods from crossing a border, you are suffocating their cash flow.
That's it, exactly.
I feel like we need a relatable analogy here for the opportunity cost concept the sources talk about. It's kind of like, imagine a local bakery that relies on one main supplier for all their flour.
Okay, yeah.
And suddenly, they're legally blocked from using that supplier. They can't just stop baking, right? They have to spend significantly more time and money finding a less efficient alternative.
Right, maybe driving 3 towns over to buy flour at retail price.
Exactly. So applying that to a nation, if the goal is to punish a government, I mean, how quickly do macroeconomic effects actually paralyze an economy? Because couldn't a country just shift to relying on its own domestic production for a while?
Well, they try, but the math catches up with them incredibly fast. And what's fascinating here is how it all compounds. It's all about currency depreciation.
Okay.
When exports are blocked, foreign currency, like US dollars or euros, it just stops flowing into their central bank. And without those globally recognized reserves to back it up, the local currency is essentially isolated on an island.
It becomes virtually worthless in the global market.
Exactly. Because international suppliers don't want to be paid in a local currency that they can't, exchange anywhere else.
Yeah, that makes total sense. If they can't spend it, they don't want it.
Precisely. And when your currency loses its value, every single thing you still manage to import, medicine, microchips, fuel, suddenly costs exponentially more. This triggers an unavoidable compounding vortex. You get slower economic growth because businesses can't afford raw materials, combined with rapidly rising inflation because everything just costs more. The foundational math of the society falls apart.
And bringing it back to that opportunity cost in global trade, it's not just a theoretical loss of potential profit.
Right.
If a targeted country still needs high-tech components to run its power grid and they are legally blocked from buying them on the open market, they don't just give up and let the grid fail.
No, they find a back door. They have to route their supply chains through illicit channels.
Yeah, they have to buy those components through a broker in a neutral third country who buys them from a shell company who maybe, smuggles them across a porous border.
Right, it gets super complicated.
And by the time the targeted government actually gets that component, they've paid a 400% markup and waited 6 months. That massive premium, that extra money and lost time is the opportunity cost.
Exactly.
It's billions of dollars bleeding out of their economy just to maintain the absolute baseline, money that should have gone to domestic infrastructure or education.
And that bleed is entirely intentional. The logic of the sanction is to make the cost of continuing their current geopolitical behavior so high, so agonizingly expensive, that the government is forced to change course.
You force them into a corner where they can't afford to run their own country.
Exactly.
Before we move on, I want to make a quick impartiality note here. As we dive into the humanitarian side, we aren't taking a side on the ethics or politics of any specific global conflicts today.
Right. We are strictly using the source material to impartially decode how economic pressure functions as a tool.
Exactly. So keeping that in mind, what does this all mean for the people actually living in that country? Because a depreciating currency isn't just a red arrow on a government stock ticker.
Oh, absolutely not.
If you live in one of these nations, that currency crash instantly trickles down to your street. Your life savings might lose 80% of its purchasing power in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it's devastating.
You check your banking app, and the money that was supposed to act as a down payment on a house can now barely buy a week's worth of groceries.
This is where the abstract mechanics of macroeconomics crash into the brutal reality of daily life. The notes are unequivocal on this point. The primary burden of these economic shocks does not fall on the political elite.
Right.
It falls disproportionately on ordinary citizens.
Because the elite are insulated. If you are a high-ranking political or military leader, you likely have assets shielded in foreign accounts or access to hard currencies and black market supply lines.
Exactly. You aren't the one feeling the squeeze when supply chains break down.
It's the vulnerable groups that face the immediate threat.
Yeah. When a country is locked out of international trade, it inevitably leads to acute shortages of basic goods. We are talking about food staples, heating fuel, and, crucially, vital medical supplies.
Even if international sanctions legally exempt humanitarian goods like medicine, which I know they often do on paper.
They do on paper, but global banks and shipping companies are usually so terrified of accidentally violating the sanctions that they just refuse to process any transactions with the targeted country at all.
Oh, wow.
It's a phenomenon called overcompliance.
Which creates a massive, tragic gap between the intended target of the policy and the actual victims. The tool is deployed to punish a government, but the people paying the toll are the elderly, those living in poverty, or anyone relying on specific imported medications.
Right.
It literally becomes a matter of life and death for people who have absolutely zero say in their government's foreign policy.
And the sources highlight how this reality forces a profound ethical dilemma onto the global stage. Diplomats and economists constantly wrestle with whether this strategy is fundamentally sound.
Because when businesses and consumers face increased costs and basic shortages, you have to ask if the diplomatic strategy is worth the human cost.
Exactly. If the goal of a foreign policy tool is to enforce a standard of international behavior, is it ethically justifiable to deploy a mechanism that inherently relies on inflicting mass economic suffering on an innocent civilian population?
Let's push on that logic for a second. So what does this all mean for the ultimate goal of the sanctions? If vulnerable citizens are the ones dealing with the shortages, doesn't that actually distract from the political pressure the sanctions are supposed to create on the leaders?
It's a glaring flaw in the underlying theory, frankly. Extreme economic hardship doesn't automatically forge political resistance.
Right. If I'm a citizen in a sanctioned country and I'm spending 12 hours a day queuing for flour and desperately trying to secure basic asthma medication for my child, I am entirely consumed by survival.
Exactly.
I don't exactly have the bandwidth, the resources, or the energy to organize a political revolution against a heavily armed regime.
More often than not, it forces a population into a state of sheer exhaustion and dependency. When private businesses collapse because of trade restrictions, the citizens become even more reliant on the government for rations and basic employment.
Looking at these historical results in our notes, there's a really strange paradox here. Because segmenting this into the actual political effectiveness, the primary purposes of sanctions are to punish governments, demonstrate international pressure, and encourage policy changes.
Right.
You would think that eventually the pressure becomes too great, the opportunity cost gets too high, and the targeted government negotiates a surrender. And sometimes they do comply.
You do sometimes.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In so many other cases outlined in the sources, they don't fold. Rather than complying, some targeted countries become even more resistant, They dig their heels in. Are sanctions simply a different kind of warfare? Like, why do some nations fold while others just double down?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the psychology of national resistance versus compliance. When a country is attacked economically from the outside, authoritarian governments don't just sit back and take the hit.
Right, they spin it.
Exactly. They actively weaponize that hardship for their own political survival. They point to the collapsing currency and the empty pharmacy shelves and say to their citizens, look, your suffering isn't due to our mismanagement. It is the direct fault of these hostile foreign powers trying to destroy our nation.
Oh, man. It's the ultimate rally around the flag effect. They completely control the narrative.
It's far more insidious than just controlling a narrative, though. The external pressure gives the regime the perfect alibi to consolidate domestic power.
Oh, I see.
They use the state of economic siege to justify declaring martial law, cracking down on internal dissent, and wiping out their political rivals under the guise of maintaining national unity against a foreign threat.
So instead of fracturing the government's grip on power, the sanctions inadvertently hand them the tools to tighten it, which really complicates the debate over whether economic sanctions are more effective than military intervention. With a military strike, the physical destruction is undeniable, but it's localized.
Right.
With an economic sanction, it's a slow bleed of the entire society, and the target government can actually hijack the intended political pressure to make themselves untouchable.
Furthermore, for the strategy to even have a chance of succeeding, it relies entirely on a structural impossibility, which is airtight global enforcement.
Oh yeah, good luck with that.
Exactly. The success of economic pressure depends on total international cooperation.
And there's always someone willing to make a buck.
Always. If the international community agrees to isolate a country, but one major global player decides to look the other way, or a neighboring country maintains a porous border for smuggling, the pressure valve is released.
It just becomes a leaky bucket.
Right. The targeted country will simply reroute their trade through those loopholes. They'll utilize shadow fleets of untraceable cargo ships. They will launder their funds through complex webs of international shell companies. In a deeply interconnected global economy, achieving absolute isolation is virtually impossible.
This brings us to a tipping point that completely changes the scope of our deep dive. When a targeted country realizes the sanctions aren't going away and they decide to resist and adapt rather than comply, they don't do it in a vacuum.
No, they definitely don't.
That resistance reshapes the entire global board, taking us from a localized economic issue to a massive worldwide complication. Let's look at the ripple effects on global politics.
The foundational concept and the source material here is globalization. Over the last 70 years, the world's economies have been carefully woven into a highly interdependent system.
Right.
We relied on unified, centralized networks for global banking, standardized shipping, and international trade. Sanctions essentially weaponize that exact interdependence. They use a country's reliance on the centralized system as leverage.
But if you cut a neighborhood off from a centralized power grid, they don't just sit in the dark forever.
Exactly.
They build solar panels. They start sharing generators. They create a localized microgrid that the main power company can no longer control, monitor, or profit from.
This raises an important question. What happens when you apply that microgrid concept to geopolitics?
Yeah.
When you isolate a nation that holds resources other countries still desperately need, like vast energy reserves, rare earth minerals, or agricultural dominance, you force them to find new friends. You trigger massive alliance formations.
They start building parallel economic systems.
They literally have no other choice. If a targeted country is kicked out of traditional global financial messaging systems like SWIFT, they can't wire money across borders.
Right.
So they develop alternative payment networks.
Yeah.
They start conducting trade in non-Western currencies. They establish heavy bilateral trade agreements with other sanctioned nations or non-aligned countries who are willing to ignore the restrictions in exchange for discounted goods.
So they essentially set up a shadow economy that operates completely outside the view and control of the nations that impose the sanctions in the first place.
Yeah, and that shadow economy rapidly increases diplomatic tensions globally. Because the nations enforcing the sanctions now have to decide, do we start sanctioning the neutral countries that are helping the target evade our rules?
Oh, wow, yeah. That's a huge escalation.
It creates a cascading effect of secondary sanctions, dragging more and more countries into the economic conflict, forcing nations around the world to pick sides.
That is the ultimate mind-bending irony for you as a listener to absorb today. A tool designed to enforce international order might actually fracture globalization itself. By wielding that immense economic pressure, enforcers are inadvertently creating competing alliances and permanently altering global cooperation.
And the most crucial insight from the sources is the permanence of this shift. Once a targeted country, or a block of targeted countries, goes through the immense agonizing pain and multi-billion-dollar effort of building an alternative supply chain, establishing a parallel banking system, and securing new trading partners, they aren't going to just dismantle it when the sanctions are eventually lifted.
Why would they? They never want to be vulnerable to that leverage again.
Precisely. That new independent architecture remains. The reliance on the unified global system is permanently broken. The global economy becomes irrevocably fragmented, and those heightened diplomatic tensions are permanently baked into the new geopolitical reality.
It is a stunning paradox. You apply pressure to pull a country back into the global order, and instead you force them to build a completely separate order of their own.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the law of unintended consequences, played out on a macroeconomic scale.
Which brings us full circle on the source material today. To synthesize what we've uncovered, economic sanctions represent the absolute ultimate intersection of economics and international politics. They are the invisible theater of war, where heavy economic costs are wielded to pursue complex geopolitical objectives without firing a single shot.
But as the notes make incredibly clear, it is a tool with severe, often uncontrollable collateral damage.
Right. So the next time you hear a news anchor talking about a new round of trade restrictions being imposed, or you see a headline about a sudden currency drop in a foreign nation, you are no longer just looking at the surface level politics.
Exactly. You can now see the invisible web at play.
You'll see the shadow supply chains and the massive opportunity costs squeezing everyday businesses. You'll understand the very real human toll, the survival mode existence falling heavily on vulnerable citizens, while the political elite remain largely untouched. And most importantly, you'll recognize the shifting global alliances forming just beneath the surface.
And as we wrap up our analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Okay.
We've spent a lot of time exploring how sanctions inevitably force targeted countries to adapt, build alternative financial systems, and forge new, competing alliances to survive. So, if the routine use of economic sanctions increasingly pushes targeted countries into forming their own alternative alliances to survive, could the ultimate long-term cost of utilizing this tool be the permanent splintering of our interconnected, globalized economy? Are we dismantling the very system we are trying to protect?
Man, that is a massive, lingering question to consider and the perfect place to leave our exploration for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time as we keep unpacking the invisible forces shaping our world.
That brings us to the end of today's episode of Simply Economics. We hope this discussion helped make today's economic concept clearer and more relevant to real life. If you found this episode useful, feel free to share it with others who are interested in understanding economics beyond the textbook. You can find Simply Economics on YouTube, Spotify, and Podbean. In our next episode, we'll continue exploring how economic theory applies to everyday decisions and real-world markets. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Simply Economics.